When you think of Europe, what's the first image that flashes across your mind? For most of us, it's the glittering lights of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, the historic majesty of London's Big Ben, the artistic streets of Barcelona, or the ancient ruins of Rome. These are the postcard-perfect icons of a wealthy, thriving continent. But there is another Europe, a Europe of cities like Belgrade, Sofia, Minsk, or Chinu. These cities are just as European, just as historic, and just as vibrant, yet they rarely make it onto the typical tourist itinerary. This disconnect points to a profound reality. Europe is a continent divided in two. On one side, you have Western Europe, an economic titan where the average GDP per capita sits at a staggering $68,000. On the other side, you have Eastern Europe, where that number plummets to just $14,000. If you look at a heat map of wealth across the continent, the result is startling. Western Europe is a sea of prosperous green, while the East is a deep, struggling red. This isn't just a minor gap. It's an invisible economic wall that hasn't moved an inch since the end of World War II. How is it possible that a single continent, connected by land, culture, and history, can harbor such extreme disparity? Why did one half become the world's playground for the ultra-rich, while the other half spent decades struggling to catch up? To understand this divide, we have to look past the beautiful architecture and dive into a complex web of geography, bloody history, and a clash of ideologies that redefine the world. Today, we're uncovering the real reason why Eastern Europe stayed poor, while Western Europe got rich. Europe might be the second smallest continent on Earth, but it has dominated the global stage for centuries. Even today, it holds massive sway over global politics and trade. Geographically, it's a peninsula of peninsulas, surrounded by the Mediterranean, Black and Caspian Seas to the south, the Arctic Ocean to the north, and the vast Atlantic to the west. It's a region that should by all accounts be unified in its success. However, the seeds of the Great Divide were planted exactly 80 years ago. As World War II drew to a close, the map of Europe was effectively sliced in half. In the West, countries embraced democracy and capitalism. In the East, nations fell under the shadow of the Soviet Union and the ideology of communism. This wasn't just a political change. It was a total overhaul of how life worked. Under the communist ideal, the state controlled everything: the land, the factories, the businesses, and the resources. The promise was equality. Everyone gets the same health care, the same education, and the same housing. On paper, it sounds fair. In practice, it killed the engine of growth. If the government owns your business and redistributes all your profits equally among everyone else, why would you work harder? Why would you innovate or take risks? Without the incentive of personal gain, the economies of the East began to stagnate. Meanwhile, the West was operating on a capitalist model. People were free to build empires, compete in the market, and keep their profits, paying only a portion back to the state in taxes. This competition fueled a massive industrial boom. While Western Europe was building the future, Eastern Europe was trapped in a bureaucratic loop. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the damage was done. Western Europe had spent nearly 50 years pulling ahead, leaving the newly liberated Eastern states decades behind. But here's the mystery. It's been over 30 years since the fall of the Iron Curtain. Why hasn't the gap closed? To find that answer, we have to look at the ground beneath their feet. Geography is often destiny, and for Eastern Europe, geography has been a double-edged sword. Take a look at countries like Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus. They are blessed with some of the most fertile soil on the planet. Vast, flat plains that should have made them the wealthiest agricultural hubs in history. But there's a catch. Flat land is great for farming, but it's a nightmare for defense. Without mountains or natural barriers to stop them, invaders have poured across these plains for centuries. Poland, in particular, might be the most invaded country in history. From the Swedish Empire and the Ottomans to the Soviets and Nazis, everyone wanted a piece of that flat, accessible land. When your country is constantly being marched over by foreign armies, it's impossible to build a stable, long-term economy. You spend your wealth on defense or rebuilding from ashes, rather than investing in the future. Contrast this with the Balkans in southeastern Europe. Here, the geography flips to the other extreme. Instead of flat plains, you have rugged, jagged mountains. While these mountains provided a natural defense that the northern plains lacked, they made modern development nearly impossible. Building roads, railways, and bridges in the Balkans is a logistical and financial nightmare. This physical isolation kept these regions disconnected from the broader European trade networks, leaving them as some of the most underdeveloped areas on the continent. Beyond the physical terrain, there is the issue of the Great Blue Advantage. If you look at the most powerful empires in history, the British, the Spanish, the French, they all had one thing in common: unrestricted access to the Atlantic Ocean. This allowed them to discover new worlds, establish colonies, and siphon the wealth of entire continents back to their capitals. At one point, just 3 Western European empires controlled 40% of the world's wealth. Eastern Europe, however, was effectively landlocked. Even the countries that do have coastlines are tucked away behind choke points. For a Polish ship to reach the Atlantic, it has to pass through the Danish Straits, which were historically controlled by Sweden or Germany, who of course charged a fee. In the south, ships from the Black Sea have to pass through the Bosporus Strait, controlled for centuries by the Ottoman Empire, and then through the Strait of Gibraltar. Eastern Europe was at the mercy of Western gatekeepers for every ton of goods they wanted to trade. While the West was getting rich off global maritime trade, the East was forced to rely on internal land trade, which is slower, more expensive, and more susceptible to disruption. Then, in the 20th century, the West got lucky again. Massive reserves of oil and gas were discovered in the North Sea. These resources turned countries like Norway, the UK, and the Netherlands into modern powerhouses. Eastern Europe, despite its fertile soil, found itself largely devoid of these high-value mineral resources. Even after the fall of communism, the transition to a market economy hasn't been smooth. The ghost of the Soviet Union still haunts the East in the form of corruption. While the West is certainly not free of corruption, it generally operates within a framework that doesn't completely derail the national interest. In many Eastern European states, however, systemic corruption has bled the economy dry. If you look at a map of the 10 most corrupt states in Europe, every single one of them is in the East. This creates a vicious cycle. High corruption leads to low foreign investment, which leads to slow growth, which leads to more corruption. Image showing corruption index map of Europe. This lack of opportunity has triggered a massive brain drain. Millions of skilled workers, doctors, and engineers have fled the East for the higher wages of the West. When a country loses its youngest and brightest minds, its future prospects dim. We saw this during the Yugoslav wars in the 90s, and we are seeing it again today with the tragic conflict in Ukraine. However, the story doesn't end in poverty. History is a wheel, and it's starting to turn. While some Western economies are beginning to stagnate under the weight of aging populations and high living costs, parts of Eastern Europe are experiencing a miracle. Poland is the prime example. Once the poor man of Europe, it is now on track to become a regional superpower. By joining the European Union and aggressively tackling corruption while investing in tech and manufacturing, Poland has seen its GDP skyrocket. It is proving that geography and history don't have to be a permanent prison. Meanwhile, some of the wealthiest nations in the West are facing internal crises. Take Ireland, for instance. On paper, it's one of the richest countries in the world, second only to Luxembourg in GDP per capita. Yet the cost of living and the housing crisis are so severe that its own citizens are starting to leave. The grass isn't always greener on the western side of the fence. The divide between East and West is a product of centuries of war, decades of failed ideology, and the simple luck of where the mountains and oceans sit. But as the world changes, that invisible line is finally starting to blur. What do you think? Will Eastern Europe eventually catch up to the West? Or will geography always keep them a step behind? And if you're interested in how a country completely flips its destiny, you have to see our deep dive into Poland's transformation. Click the video on your screen now to see how the poor man of Europe is becoming its next titan. Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay tuned for more deep dives into the forces that shape our world. See you in the next one.